Considering it's been 10 years, actually more than 10 years since the last Coal Chamber release, one could easily assume that we've never talked about the band on this channel, and they would be right. But that all is going to change today, May the 19th, 2015, where we get to talk about their new album, Rivals, which was just released today. Now, ever since the band broke up, Dez has been focusing on his new band, which was Devildriver. So we've talked about that band on the channel. We've talked about Winter Kills. I think that was their most recent release a couple of years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong. So we need to actually look at a couple of different things whenever we examine Rivals. We need to actually not go in 100% with a blank slate, but also not 100% with heightened expectations. We shouldn't go in expecting something amazing after such a long layover. So what do we need to expect? What should we be looking for? The first thing that we really need to look at is to see whether or not Dez's writing style from Devildriver has transitioned over onto Rivals at all, and whether or not it's something that actually transforms the band a little bit from what they were from the 1990s to early 2000s. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, how is this album going to affect their legacy? Because this is a band that, between those years of the end point of the 1990s, the first portion of the 2000s, were kind of an unsung hero for nu metal. Definitely one that has a lot of major influence that they provided to bands that came after them. So is this perhaps an album that could catapult the next generation of nu metal? Could we actually see a revitalization of the genre based around this album? Well, we're going to talk about that. So Rivals, the first album in 13 years, and the first thing that needs to be said is that Coal Chamber sound definitely doesn't sound as though it has aged all of that much, which is the first positive thing that I will mention. Coal Chamber is a band that, even though nu metal itself certainly feels a bit tired and dried out, that it's kind of been overused to death a little bit and has not really experienced a real sonic exploration in quite some time, Coal Chamber still sounds extremely fresh and extremely new, kind of like the sound that they are able to produce. Definitely has a unique timbre to it that gives them a bit of an edge by comparison to others. Secondly, whenever it comes to Dez's writing from Devildriver, it is something that is prevalent within this album, especially near the middle portion of this disc. It's something where the heaviness on Rivals seems to be amped up compared to the other trio of albums that are in Coal Chamber's discography. This is something where that aggressive point certainly seems to be counterbalanced near the choruses or the ends of tracks with some pretty good guitar lines that resemble a little bit more toward the nu metal side as opposed to whatever you would consider Devildriver. But it still is something that is prevalent in the fact that the aggression level seems to be dialed up a little bit on this album. Now, we have to also mention track 4, Suffer in Silence, which features Al Jorgensen from Ministry on this, and this is a pretty awesome collaboration that you have, even though Al is heard more toward the end point of this song, and it's something that's more of a spoken word type ideal. There is definitely a presence on this track that definitely puts it a bit over the top. Now, as far as the way in which this album flows and the overall way in which this album seems to progress, it's one that does not feel like it's excessively jilty or jittery. It doesn't sound like a band that's coming home after a long layover or a long vacation and immediately kind of has to get their feet wet a little bit before, you know, really finding their stride and finding their own. This isn't a baseball player coming out of spring training with perhaps a bit of a cold streak as opposed to being red hot from the start. Instead, this is definitely an album that feels like it has solid ground underneath of it, and the flow of it certainly reflects that. It has a grand amount of poise and feels very comfortable within itself. All of the tracks seem to flow very nicely together to exhibit a nice cohesive unit of an album. There are a couple of short tracks that are more instrumental or have a little bit of, I would consider it just an interlude or an introductory feel to it, such as Orion and Dumpster Dive. Orion actually, though, has some interesting spoken word lyricism to it that definitely causes a transition between The Bridges You Burn and Another Nail in the Coffin to seem very, very apt. It's interesting on many counts how much the title structures and everything do seem to perhaps suggest a little bit of a Devildriver tone to it. So it's interesting how even the minor details seem to lean a little bit more toward Dez's influence from that band being present on this new Coal Chamber album. Now, if I were to have some criticisms about this disc, there are a few. For one, there are some tracks that feel like they could easily have concluded about 30 to 40 seconds prior to their actual conclusion. It seems as though this is something where there is a need for a little bit of excess at the end of some songs after you would think that the logical cycle has ended. This is instead something that doesn't boost the album's rapport. It's instead one that acts as a bit of a deterrent. It's one that kind of aims to disrupt the flow a little bit, or feels like it's aiming to disrupt the flow a little bit, but it's something that is nicely recovered by some really, really great hooks at the beginnings of following tracks that follow this example. A great example I can think of is right near the end with Empty Handed. It definitely feels like that is a track that could have ended within the 3-minute, 30-second mark, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. Going into Worst Enemy, which also feels as though it was one that was extended a little bit, but as a final track, I can kind of let that be. The second thing that I will say is that even though Coal Chamber's sound still has a certain freshness level to it, it is something that is still subjected to a little bit of the nu metal criticisms. It's one where there is a bit of simplicity to it. It's one where there is a bit of triteness to it. And it's an album that, unfortunately, coming out 15 years after nu metal's real height, it's an album that was going to suffer from that idea one way or the other, whether it was going to be part of a movement that was a nostalgic idea or not. It was still going to be something that was going to have a bit of a trite and overdone feel. But Coal Chamber is a group where, since the amount of material is not large, it's something that's a little bit more ignorable at times. Aside from that, the tracks on this album are pretty good. The only thing, and the last criticism that I would have, is that I don't really see anything that's truly identifiable as singles or anything that's going to necessarily put this album over the top and really set it on fire. I know that I.O.U. Nothing, the very first track on this album, was released as a single, and it was one that felt a bit like it traveled underneath the radar, almost like a perfect metaphor for most of Coal Chamber's career. Even though they have a very strong and dedicated fan base, they were definitely overshadowed by other groups in the nu metal department, such as Limp Bizkit or Disturbed or Godsmack. So I feel that this album suffers from that same fate, where all of these tracks are going to feel like they are just underneath the radar, not quite at that point where they're going to go above and perhaps replicate the success of their very first album, which went gold. Overall, though, the album is not a bad experience. It was a pretty interesting listen, and I feel that for this being the first album in 13 years for Coal Chamber, that many core fans that were perhaps thinking that this would never happen are going to be satisfied with the result. They may not necessarily feel that this is as good as the very first self-titled record. However, that is fully 100% an opinion. I would myself give it a 76 out of 100. I feel that it holds its own just enough in order to really satisfy. It definitely will foster in some fans from this new generation of music fan to either go back to Coal Chamber if they listened to them before, either that, or perhaps have them go back and pick out some of their earlier work if they can indeed find it, and kind of make it a quest for these individuals. So I do think it will bring in some fans. I just don't think that it's going to bring in the wealth that perhaps this reunion was hoping to bring in. But that being said, what did you guys think about Rivals? What did you think about this new album? The first album by Coal Chamber in 13 years. Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and or dislike the video, whichever way you really fall in this matter. And if you like this and want to see more, there are plenty more reviews and other videos on this channel. So please do subscribe and check them out. there's just a ton of them. We're talking like close to 1,400 videos. It's ridiculous, but that means that there's a wealth of musical information at your disposal, and that is what truly makes this a very unique channel, especially if you happen to be a heavy metal fan. Once again, let me know what you thought about the album underneath in the comments. Thank you very much. I will see you guys tomorrow.